So in this demo, I'm going to take you through Cubase. This is Cubase Pro version 9.5. What we're going to learn is digital audio production. We're going to learn to create music. I'm an electronic dance, trance, and progressive house producer. And we're going to learn how to construct a track from scratch, starting with a blank slate. I'm going to cover everything from routing audio and using plugins and mixing, automation, mix down, bouncing MIDI to audio. Everything I can think of that I use in my workflow, I'm going to teach you how to use. And we're going to start by just looking at the overall interface of Cubase, and there's a ton of stuff here going on. So you can see here when it first opens up, you just have this folder, and it's an input-output channel, and you have your stereo out, and that refers to the mixer. I got this in another window, so I'm going to be dragging this in from time to time. You've got your track listing down this panel here. You've got an editor window, and you can see there's tabs in this interface. You can get a mini console, mixing console here. Get the editor. You have a sampler, control here, chord pads. There's just a ton of stuff, and you can configure each window with what you want to have showing in a couple different places here. So there's even more than what's shown here. In the configuration panel here, you can see it's showing you all these things that you have going. You know, if you don't use a rewire, you can turn that off. If you only want to see your MIDI tracks, you can check that off. So it's good to know. This is like an easy way to show and hide a bunch of stuff when you're working in limited monitor real estate. Then you have undo and redo right here. I usually use keyboard commands for most of that stuff, but you can close this and reopen it, right? So you want to see what's in here. And again, there's your timeline here. Now I'm clicking and holding and dragging down, and you can drag back and forth. If you go up, it's like zoom out, and if you go down, it's zoom in. And I'm still holding the mouse. And you can drag with the pencil tool if you want to. That's one bar now, and by default this is 4/4 time. Okay, you can change that as well. Down here you have your compensation, almost never use. Common record modes, we'll get into that later, but you can like punch in, punch out, and stuff like that. Here's your audio recording tools. If you want to keep history, you can play over and over, and it will keep all the different tracks that you've recorded. Here's where you have MIDI recording information, where you can kind of do the same thing. If you want to loop and record, you can create new parts. You can merge the current one that you're playing in with the one you recorded. You can replace it, mix and overwrite. We'll get into all that. Then you have, this is a little CPU meter, so you can see nothing going on right now, so the CPU meter is at 0. Here's your track indicators, locators I should say. So if you notice, go to right indicator, that little button there, and the playback head moves to 2, and you can see here's where it's showing you I'm on bar 2, and go back to bar 1, and you can click into any one of these. You can type into each of these slots. You can use arrow keys. So if you wanted a four bar phrase, you can just stop at bar 5. You can zoom out here a little bit. You can drag this guy to zoom in and out. You can drag the slider handles. Now Cubase designed all of this to fit as much stuff on the interface as possible. And then over here you can see you have your rack. So this is your rack instruments that you can bring in. This is where your VST instruments show up. You can have both rack instruments and track instruments. We'll talk about the difference. Here's your transport. So rewind, play. This is setting loop, and you can see when I set it to loop, it turns purple. So this would be looping on a 4-bar phrase. If I want to loop on only a 2-bar phrase, I can roll over this and scroll the mouse wheel. If I want to, just a single bar phrase. This right here is your punch in and punch out. So as an example, let's say, you know, playing for the first two measures, and then I want to punch in at bar 3 and punch in at bar 4. This little lock, I'm not 100% sure what that does, but you can see this lock will actually lock it to the single scroll bar, and then if you unlock it, that's right. So now you have your ability to have a section that you're working with, and then punch in and punch out before and after. So a punch in is like a little down red arrow, and punch out is a up right arrow. So what that means is, like, you can be playing your playback head, you can automatically, it's like you have extra hands in the recording studio, right? So you can just hit punch in, punch out automatically, and you can play the playback head will go across here. It will record for these 3 bars, and that's it. So I'm going to undo that for now. I don't need to punch in yet. Here you have how you're going to display time. So this is bars and beats by default. And if you select this little music note, you can change it to seconds, in which case, 5, 10, 15, that's the number of seconds. And then there's also time code and samples if you're working with video. Those are helpful. I'm going to go back to bars and beats, because for doing electronic music production, that's almost all. Bars and beats is what you want to know. And so here's your tempo. You have 120 BPM. It's a typical starting point for most music. You can double click in here, type in a tempo. Say we'll do 128. Speed it up just a little bit. Then you have your metronome. Turn on your click. And then you can open the settings here. And this shows you how many bars it's going to count in before it starts going. And it'll click while recording. It's not going to record it, obviously, but you'll hear it. And then you have media if you have instruments and samples, stuff like that. Control room is something where if you have a separate recording studio, probably most people won't use that. And you have your meter. This is another thing where I rarely go to this meter, because I use the meters in the fader in the mixing console. And then, so in the mixing console, there's even more stuff, right? So you have the faders, obviously mixing in and out of the volume of a specific track. Panning right here, pan left and right. And if you just put, you can type in here also, type C for center. And there's a little drop down and in here. And then you have mute and solo. And you can see that's also up here. There's an indicator for that you're in a state where you're muting or soloing something. Then you have an edit track. So editing the channel, this is like a deep dive into the channel editor. Before we get into that, you have inserts, and you can put inserts in here. So anything that comes with Cubase will be showing in here. So for example, you could put a compressor right there on the channel. That's how you would do that. If you want to take that off, you can just say no effect. So you have inserts. You have EQ, and this is a simple EQ here. This is a 4-part EQ. I actually find it much easier to EQ in here. So here's your equalizer. It's the same exact 4 things that you're seeing. Here's the channel strip is typical mixing console. You have gate, and you can turn on the gate. Not sure. There you go, noise gate. Okay, and then compressor. They got 3 standard compressors. You can go standard, tube, or vintage. So we'll put a tube compressor on there. Crank up the input a little bit. De-esser, tape saturation, and a limiter. So these are, your standard things that you have on a fancy console. You can turn all these on. Every time you turn on one of these things, it adds a little bit of CPU, takes a little bit of CPU power away. So I usually start by using none of this stuff. I'm just showing you where it's at right now. You can discard that. So you have a full-blown professional channel strip right here. Here's all your inserts, and you can do custom routing of inserts if you want to. Here's your destination. So if you have send effects, we'll get into this later, how you'd use the destination. And then here's where you have read and write of your automation. We'll get into that later as well. So that's just by hitting the edit channel settings on the channel. And I was just showing you the stereo channel, the stereo output. So basically you're going to work in this interface to dial in on the channel settings, and then as you're recording you can open up this and you'll see the same things are set there. And oh, by the way, you can save presets for certain things. If you get some vocal setting or drum kick mic or something like that, you can save presets for all that. So from a workflow standpoint, it's a really good idea to save presets on things you do. Okay, so that's the mixer in a nutshell. Now every time you add a MIDI instrument, a new track, anything, it's all going to show up on here on the visibility panel of your mixer. Zones haven't done too much with. You can set up different zones for your mixing, and then history, you can see basically everything you did. So if you forget something, what you added, or sound of your mix changes, you can go back and look in the history and see what you changed about your mix. This little sync button, just leave the default. You don't need to worry about that. Okay, up here at the top, again, you have your standard racks that have inputs, inserts, sends, your channel strip, mute and solo. You can reset the mutes right here. So if you have a bunch of tracks muted, you can click on this button up here and it will undo everything. Here's your read and write. You're activating recording, mixer automation, and reading it. We'll get into that later. Suspend all read-write functions is just if you want to temporarily turn that off. It won't delete anything. It'll just temporarily bypass it. Bypassing inserts, bypassing EQs, bypassing channel strip. So these are things you're using if you're working with audio, and if you're working with MIDI in the beginning with VST instruments and MIDI tracks, you're not going to deal with this until you actually bounce that to audio and you're doing your final mix. Linking channels can be helpful if you want to do if you want to link a bunch of faders together. So for instance, all of your drums, and turn all of your drums at once, down or up at once. It's helpful in here. Suspend and absolute mode is like forcing different parameter settings to take effect or not. I've never used Q-Link. That has something to do with temporarily linking channels together. And then here's your number of channels, and then reducing the rack height and the what does that say? Increasing the rack height, right? So that's a tour of the mixer. I'm going to move this back out of the way for right now. And where did my song go? Here's my Cubase project on this window. Okay, so